only started in 2019. And like South Africa, which I have had to talk to some of them, it's Dr. Unido and all those, because I've had a lot of deliberations across the African landscape. They started when the market had taken shape, and the market was ahead of them, which we are seeing as most of the cases in Africa. Why is that so? Because most of the African countries import vehicles from across the world. So while some people have combined hybrid vehicles into Ghana and be charging, and all this taking place, we have that ecosystem where they will take ahead of us and government comes in. But government came in, we started this initiative and we're pushing it on every angle. It's three things that we see as the major challenges. Awareness creation, the EV education is very low in Ghana. I drive an electric vehicle in Ghana, and on the vehicle, I have a lot of things written on it. Electric is the future and a lot of things, right? I see myself as a moving billboard on most of the occasions. People would pause and want to look under my car to see if there's an exhaust fume. Is it true? Does this car really exist in Ghana? There are those who stop me to just insult me. What do you mean? Ghana is not ready for EVs. There are those who stop me to take a picture. And so it's a mixed feeling on every side. So keyly, awareness has been one of the major issues, which if you notice, we organized the first e-mobility conference in Ghana in 2021. It's on YouTube and you can also watch it. That conference was themed about the opportunities and challenges. And if you were there, you notice that some of these challenges I'm about to say as well were mentioned during this conference. Awareness being key of them. That conference had an exhibition of electric vehicles. And for the first time, people sat in electric cars in Ghana to drive around. For most people, that was the first time they were seeing EVs in their life. And it's true, most people didn't even believe there were EVs in Ghana. So key on the agenda is awareness creation, and it's going deeper. It's not just awareness in terms of the user, but it's awareness even in terms of the private sector that want to come on board to actually do the business. Some just see it as business. They don't even have the in-depth understanding of the business that they want to come into. So we are pushing not only that, but also last year we organized a public charging forum where we got participants, both people who are actually trying to go into the business and those are the potentials. And we brought people from around the world, from the IEA, which I sit on a number of their committees, so they've been supportive in terms of that from Ghana. The IEA was on board, the Dundee City Council, which I work closely with as well. So all the people on the international landscape doing EVs and charging infrastructure were on board to actually have a training and a whole session come out of it. Now we have Nissan that is about to launch that will become the 6th charging station just in airport. And that was a collaboration between them and Wallbox from Spain, which was one of the participants at that public charging forum. So it's also what I'm trying to say then, that public awareness creation is key, both in the private sector and in the individuals. Then we have what I will also term as another challenge, which is actually being solved: standards and regulations, standardization. We know that we need permits, we know we need standardization for all of these things. Standardization mainly is coming in terms of the charging infrastructure, because as we know, chargers just like around the world don't have the same thing across the world. We have charging nozzles, GBT for China, we have the Tesla ones, we have those for Europe, we have it all across the world. So basically for Ghana, we need to also set the standards. And standards committee, it has to be a whole committee, an electrotechnical committee, which started this year. We sat since February, and we just finished our last meeting this May, first week in May. So I can say that Ghana is adopting the IEC standards for standardization on electric cars. And that on its own now breathes us, when we are done gazetting those standards, we tend to write the regulations for charging regulations in the country, and those go to Parliament. The process is quite a long one. It is so because we need to bring all participants on board. When we're doing one thing in government, it cannot be just you need the stakeholders on board to be able to create a technical committee. The technical committee had members from all across, from ECG, Ghana Standards was leading it, from even we had people on the ground. We had POBAD on board, we had Nissan on board, we had car manufacturers, we had all these people come on board because their inputs is always required when you want to do this. And so it takes time to do this, but it's a process that has already been done because the meetings are done. We just need to be able to gazette those standards, and then those standards go to be used to draft regulations that we can enforce. But notwithstanding, even though we don't have regulations, we're working closely with the private sector, because I have said, and I will continue to say, that for the EV charging infrastructure in Ghana, it's going to be a public-private partnership. It's going to be one that the public sector will need to create a conducive environment, but it's going to be led by the private sector because they are going in as the business, but we are getting the environment ready for them. And that is what we are doing. So currently, when people want to install charging stations in Ghana, they write a letter of intention to the Energy Commission. They add the accompanying documentations to those. They set about in that letter the location that the station is going to be. They mention to us the standards of the equipment they're about to use, the IEC confirmation of those standards. All of those things will be stated in the letter. After we receive those letters, then I'll go through a process. We get them in working with either ECG, NEDCO, Enclave, and these are the distribution agencies in Ghana. So they have to work closely with these people, establish charging station, and make sure they're following every rule, because ECG will have to do an assessment mapping of the area and a lot more details that go into it. So although we don't have the regulations yet adopted by Parliament, because that process is long, we are all working together, and that is why we know where every charging station is, what is happening out of charging stations, and all those. But there are, as you rightly said, a lot of people who charge from home. I charge from my home. I charge from public stations as well. I like to drive out of town a lot, so sometimes I charge at public charging stations. But my battery is it's a 60 kilowatt battery that goes 500 kilometer range. So I can be able to go quite far with it before I charge again. So it's relative. But what that also means for us is that we have to establish the regulations, not only in terms of the regulations are not just going to be for public charging, but it's also going to touch on private charging as well. And if you read the baseline study, which I'll drop the link, you see all the actors and players in the e-mobility sector that we believe that the implementation action plan to make the ecosystem viable would actually work for us. So really, it will be these two big major challenges. But the third one, which I know everybody is key for me to talk about, is incentives. Because of the price of EVs, because we are not yet assembling a lot of EVs in Ghana, because all the assembly plants in Ghana are unfortunately iced, and that's a conversation for another day. We have to be able to find a way to reduce the price of these vehicles. But these vehicles, right now, as we stand, Ghana's customs import duties is not set for just one country. It's an ECOWAS duty. So it requires more than just one country collaborating to either slash import duties or that. And that is why that conversation takes longer than it will be. But I can say that the Ministry of Finance, after we submitted proposals, has agreed to set up a committee, and we have the committee already established. So work is now beginning to now decide how we can get the waivers that will work not just for EVs, but also for renewable and for batteries. So it's a bigger context of waivers. It's more about promoting an era of green and sustainable energy growth in Ghana. So these will be the three I'll talk about now. And as you can see, I have also deliberated also on the opportunities and what we are working on to make sure it works. But on financing, though, we push for financing for a lot of people. SunRef today finance solar taxi in their bikes. And that came out as a conversation after the e-mobility conference, trying to push SunRef. If you know, SunRef sits at the Energy Commission, and it's funded by the Agence Française de Développement from the French. We have that facility sitting under SunRef, which is within the Energy Commission. So we try to push for e-mobility development for a lot of private sectors, of which solar taxi is one of the people that has benefited from. There's another car company in Tema that does fleet of EVs. Currently, they have 6 e-buses in Ghana, and they run through the country. They are mini buses in Ghana, and they are also working to increase their fleet to 20, and it's going to be getting some support through through this funding as well. So it's possible, but it takes time and it's a process. Do we start it? Yes, we've started it. But is it going to be that fast? Is it going to be like a magic wand and everything will be solved? No. But is government working towards it? Yes, we are working. And that is some of the things I've just tried to tell you now. So government is doing its best. It's not poor policy, but it's just that market took a bit of a fast speed ahead of us, but we're working with everybody. And that is why we have a way of working with everybody, even without regulations yet in place. Everybody is in line. It's a public-private partnership, and that's what we are promoting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris. I mean, this has been very enlightening and quite an interesting one from you. And we're glad that already there's some major inroads being made in this space by Ghana. I mean, going forward, I just want to talk a little bit to Tobias. Africa has had the opportunity to improve economic, environmental, and social conditions by becoming a meaningful player in the emerging EV market. Yet it seems the continent is being left behind in the transition. I mean, of course, South Africa, the leading market for EVs in Africa, currently has only 6,000 on the road. And we know, and the same applies to other nascent markets across the continent, sorry. Now, what in your work, in terms of your study, what do you think is the role of industrial policy in increasing demand and building local capacity for EV manufacturing?
Yes, thank you, Charles. I now have the picture again because you were gone for like 10, 15 minutes, but it's good to also see the room and you know who I'm speaking to. So thanks for the invitation, and I would have loved to be there, but it wasn't possible, unfortunately, so I'm sending greetings from Berlin. Yeah, actually, regarding your question, I think I also have to broaden the perspective a little bit beyond Ghana, because I know a little bit also about the Volkswagen investment there, for example, and Ghana actually taking some steps on their automotive industrial policy. But I have to move a little bit to other countries to say a few more meaningful things, because my knowledge on the individual cases is limited. So I think what was discussed so far and what has been emphasized a lot is the local perspective and local startups and what can actually happen on the roads, also in terms of positive impacts if a combustion engine three-wheelers or two-wheelers, for example, are replaced by battery-driven two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and the positive impacts on air quality and these things. And I think all of this is very important, but one perspective to certainly bring in is the perspective of the global value chain and thereby exports. Because one of the things that I always emphasize in my work, which has come out of looking at South Africa in detail, but also comparing it to other countries, is the issue of scale. And I actually believe that this will not significantly change with the transition to electric vehicles, because the automotive industry remains a very capital-intensive industry. So, and that has implications for automotive industrial policy, which needs both action locally on the local market and making EVs more attractive, which we have heard a lot from Doris. That is very important, but the other side of the coin is also very important, and that is looking towards export markets and actually strategizing about where could a production location fit into regional and global supply chains. And the implication for policy is to find the spot and to make it attractive to be that spot, which includes a lot of things that I don't need to go into now in detail, but for example, bans on imports of vehicles, and incentivizing local production and getting the scale. And so far on the African continent, 2 countries have managed to do this in ICE vehicles, and that's South Africa and Morocco, who both have production of, I think in Morocco last year was around 500,000 or 400,000, in South Africa between 500,000 and 600,000 vehicles per year, and it hovers around that a little bit. And that is actually the kind of scale that at least allows you to have a local supply chain, and to have full-scale vehicle plants by the foreign OEMs that have invested, and it's foreign OEMs always, to start with, to attract the supply chain. And while the startups on the local market are important, I think this part is also very important, to get this FDI into the country, ideally in electric vehicles, and then because the scale aspect has several positive effects. It allows for local supply chain. It allows for more employment, both in assembly and in component manufacturing. It allows for local component firms to get involved in the supply chain, and it's actually not a dichotomy, so that you say the local component firms are competing against the foreign firms. It's actually a growing together. So the bigger the scale, the bigger the production volumes per vehicle model, the better is also the situation for local firms to get involved in the supply chain. And this will not change with the shift to electric vehicles. And the last point is R&D. Actually, South Africa doesn't have any automotive R&D, or very limited. And Morocco also has very limited automotive R&D, because their production volumes are still too low to make it attractive to become an R&D center regionally or globally. So that is also very important to keep in mind, that scale is also an enabling factor for R&D. And of course, we face the issue of saying, okay, then should we just throw our hands up in the air and say it's not going to be possible if we need, because who is going to buy the 1 million cars that need to be produced, for example? But I think it's thinking about this strategically, which is already being done for ICE vehicles across the African continent, also seeing where could different regions find their niche to not take business away from each other. And I think that's the way to go. And that's, I think, just one thing that is very important about automotive industrial policy to think about.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tobias. But I'd like to follow up with a question. I mean, you talked about scale, and given the importance of economies of scale for competitiveness, what is the scope for building, regional alliances and collaborations in terms of African startups climbing up the global e-mobility value chain?
Yeah, as I said, I mean, regional alliances are very important. And in Africa, for example, this is also being done under the African Automotive Association of Manufacturers, I think AAAM they are called. And it's also about the connection between Ghana and South Africa, for example, and getting into conversation and making component suppliers from South Africa to come to Ghana to collaborate. Obviously, this is mostly ICE at the moment and not EVs. But I think it's important to unpack this climbing up the value chain. So for what does it mean for a startup, a local startup like Solar Taxi is the case that you discussed today, but there's also an example in South Africa, I forgot her name, but they also make electric three-wheelers for package delivery, and they want to export to the European market, for example, because they've understood the issue of scale is important. But it's really about, okay, climbing up the EV value chain. This kind of firm, can it do that? Possibly it can, but I think it's really important to bring so what it can do is actually it can produce maybe for some external markets, even though the competition is going to be very high because the barriers to entry into this kind of thing are low. So climbing up the value chain really means to acknowledge what I said in my first comment and take that as a reality, because if you want to climb up the value chain, it's about attracting FDI in electric vehicles, having a strategy around that, ideally not attracting, 15 different assemblers, but 2 that like what Morocco has done for ICE, to really be strategic about this and generating the scale so that this upgrading, local firms getting involved, R&D becoming possible, more local sourcing of materials and components, that all of these things can happen. So regional collaboration can absolutely factor in terms of scale, but also export beyond regional markets in Africa, I think, will be an essential component of that. And it's extremely difficult to pull off, but it's important to think about what could be possible in this space.
Okay, thank you so much, Tobias. I mean, because you've just talked about these regional value chains, I'd like to come straight to Jane, you know, from the UNEP. You know, the electric mobility program won by the UN Environment to foster the uptake of electric mobility. But with a focus on transitional and developing countries, the program is targeting the reduction of energy use, greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions from the transport sector. Now, together with your regional partners, we know that the UN Environment supports the development of an adequate policy packages, the setup of pilot projects, as well as strategies to finance the transformation towards electric mobility. I'd like to find out if you can give us a quick overview of this program and how can other stakeholders become partners.
Thank you, Charles. Maybe just before I get into the question, I would like to just give some brief comments on what Doris and Tobias have actually shared. Doris talked about the issue of standards, and you know, I think that's quite important. Yes, she talked about charging infrastructure standards, but I would go beyond that. You know, I'll go beyond just charging infrastructure, because, for example, we see a lot of you know, we've been working with Africa to put in place used vehicle regulation, you know, to reduce emissions and to stop really the import of almost towards end of life vehicles or waste being shipped into the region. And that's a big challenge because a lot of countries don't have standards. So not just for charging infrastructure, I would say if you look at a lot of the Latin American countries, when it comes to buses, you know, countries like San Diego that have actually been able to, you know, scale up their e-buses program, it's because of the standards. They have quite strict standards on the buses. So the buses have to be at Euro 6, whatever the technology. And Euro 6 buses are able almost price-wise to compete with the e-buses. If you look at a lot of the African countries, the bus standards are at Euro 0. So it's very hard for an e-bus, you know, when you go to an operator, the cost is quite prohibitive because of lack of standards. So maybe that's what I just wanted to add, the issue of standards, not just charging, but the vehicle standards themselves, so that at least they are competitive with the e-buses. And Tobias actually talked quite importantly about scale. We see that as a big, big challenge for Africa. You know, you're talking about 1 or 2 buses, 6 buses, you know, the issue of scale. And that's one of the things we're trying to see. Can we, you know, bring countries together, regions together? Can there be scale? Because that's when you also get the interest of the OEMs, you know, the manufacturers, when it comes to, you know, their supplies and such, when they are scale. So I think that's quite important, you know, an important thing that both of them mentioned. On the e-mobility program, I would say, just to give an overview, this has evolved. You know, we started supporting the African countries right from, I would say, around 2010 to look at import, because predominantly, you know, almost all African countries import vehicles, predominantly also used vehicles. So one of the programs that we had was on the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, which was still funding countries. And under this program, we were supporting countries to do baselines, to look at what kind of vehicles were they importing over time. Were they more energy efficient? And what kind of policies could they put in place to at least incentivize more efficient vehicles? And of course, now when the electric mobility program started, that's the most fuel efficient vehicle. So that was incorporated into that program and evolved into the electric mobility project. So we have experience under that program. We've supported under the GFEI, the fuel efficiency program. We've worked with close to 70 countries globally. We've worked with close to 30 countries in Africa to look at their vehicle fleet, and that has actually incentivized a lot of the countries to shift or to start thinking. When we started the project, even now more aggressively on the EV, around 2017, 2018, a lot of the countries were seeing this as, a technology of the future. But I'm very glad to see that, the private sector has taken it up. Governments are actually putting in place programs, policies to expand the uptake. So under the Global Electric Mobility Project, of course, the objective, and we're working with other partners, for example, other UN agencies are part of this program, the International Energy Agency, some of the regional development banks, we have also strategic partners involved in this project. So the objective is to support the global south. So we are only supporting developing and transition countries to shift towards electric mobility, to put in place strategies, to put in place incentives, to see how to link, with renewable energies. We're also supporting countries to look at other cross-cutting issues of, for example, end of life, vehicles, batteries and such, how do you dispose of those? Specifically, on this project, we have about 50 countries we are working with, some, in-depth, others not in-depth. In Africa, we are working with about 15 countries. It has different donors. The main donor being the Global Environment Facility, GEF. So we got funding under the GEF 7. We're now working with countries to see whether they can join the project under GEF 8. So countries can earmark some of their allocations, funding allocation under this sort of, for example, under GEF towards the project. And this funding goes to the countries to implement electric mobility projects, to look at strategies, to look at exactly what I said, institutional framework to support e-mobility, incentives, scaling up, end of life, and links with renewable energy. So that's what we are supporting. I would say we have under this program also looking at various modes, not just the 2-3-wheelers, but also e-buses. We see that as a big, plus for us. So not just the modes, also we have topical, how to bring in the issue of gender and other issues, And then under this project, we are not only supporting cities and countries, we also are working at Africa-wide regional level. In all the sub-regions, we have what we are calling the support and investment platforms. So we have the Africa Support